boys and girls. Welcome back to beer school for this week. The weather is warming up nicely. People are getting out, doing more. Now that the government's letting us go on hiking excursions, go camping, and do a lot more outside, of course, your thirst for beer starts to change too. That warm weather, the outdoors activity, and all that stuff means you probably will be wanting something to stray from the cold weather beers, like the porters and the stouts and heavier IPAs, to go towards something a little bit lighter, crisper, more refreshing. And that's the reason why we're talking about the low-cal IPA today, or low-cal L today. When we talk about low calorie, this is a trend that started a couple of years ago. Whenever people's income become a little bit more steady, and then people start caring more about things like their waistline or calorie counting. That just happens in times of good prosperity. So that's been something that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years, and it really grew last year. I noticed last summer a lot of these seasonal beers from breweries, they started going away from something more flowery and just banal light. Summer ales, blonde ales, even pilsners, and they started taking the IPA and reducing it somewhat. Now that's not unusual, because closer to 8 or 9 years ago we started seeing the similar kind of spin-off from the standard IPA, as people realized they love hops, they love the bitterness, they love the fruitiness, they love all the characteristics of IPA, but they didn't want it at 7.5% alcohol. That palate tick has allowed us to really want the flavors of stronger flavored beers. However, whenever you get a beer like an IPA that's very refreshing, very crisp, and very clean, and it comes at 7% alcohol, you have a tendency to want to drink them very quickly, but at that alcohol range, it's really not advisable. That's too high to be a sessionable or an easy kind of beer. So at that point, 2015, 2014, we saw the session IPA become a little bit of a trend. It was all that flavor you want in an IPA, just with a lower alcohol content. It became drier, it was coming in ranges between 4 and 5% usually, and people kind of found favor with that for a while. The problem is the session IPA still had the price point of a higher alcohol beer, so people very quickly decided, okay, maybe I don't want to stick with these session IPAs too long, so that fad was kind of short-lived. The last 4 or 5 years, I've kind of seen the trailing off a little bit of the sales of session IPAs. Brewers stopped making so many of those. But now we see a resurgence, and it's doctored up a little bit differently. It's not called the session IPA anymore, it's called a low-cal IPA. And of course, that low-cal moniker has really piqued the interest of people and their buying power. So they kind of want a beer that is very sessionable, very easy, and easy on the waistline, and a little bit easier on the pocketbook. So brewers have really catered to that a little bit by creating a beer that has less calories, that has a little bit lighter palate impact, so you can drink more of them without palate fatigue becoming such an issue. And so it's really become a fun fad for people to really enjoy these a little bit. Now, going back even further, the term session ale refers to something that developed in the British pubs in the 1600s, 1700s. And what that referred to was a beer that you could drink multiple of these imperial pints, a pint glass that was about 20 ounces or so. You're able to drink these in rapid succession at the pubs on your way home from work and catch up with the gossip of the day. It was largely an activity that was relegated to the men who worked out in the community, and then they would drink these beers on the way home. That's the only way they found out about the news of the day. That's the only way they found out about gossip or what's going on in politics. And so they would drink these session IPAs and go home, and after a couple of those, 3.5% alcohol, they didn't feel so taxed by the alcohol content that they could go and do their chores at home. Spend time with the family, do other things like that without the inebriation becoming such an issue. So whenever the session IPAs from America developed, they did so with that British moniker in mind, and those terms were called session because you could drink multiple of them in one session and not become too drunk. So when the session IPA really took off, that was kind of the spin that they took, and then the low-cal option was a spin off of those session ales. One of the neat things about these beers is how the recipe has changed a little bit, and going from a session IPA to a low-cal IPA. One thing that they are doing is being very conscious about the grain character. The grain is what carries all the carbohydrates, and that's usually the trigger for most of the calories in beer, is the carbohydrates, those residual sugars that's left over after fermentation is done. So what brewers have a tendency to do is, okay, let's choose grains that have a tendency to break down more completely from starches to sugars. And if you say, well, wait a minute, don't we want less sugar in the beer? Well, the key is to make these sugar sources so simplistic that the yeast has a very easy time absorbing them and turning them into alcohol rather than leaving those sugars behind. If the sugar character is too complex, then the yeast may run out of its power, run out of its ability to ferment before the sugar is all taken up and digested by them. So what you want is a very dry beer that's void of residual sweetness. So how you do that is you choose a grain that doesn't leave a whole lot of residual sweetness behind. You can use things like rice, corn, some other grains like that. They're considered inferior grains if you use too many of them. But those are techniques the brewers, if you're a really well-crafted brewery, you know how to use those grains in the right kind of way to ensure that you get complete dryness without the flavor becoming a detriment to the overall character of the beer. Some other things you can do is you can choose your barley sources a little bit more wisely. Some of your big industrial light lagers have known this for a very long time. The grains like 6-row barley rather than 2-row barley. The 6-row barley has more enzyme activity inside of the husk, so the potential to break those starches down to sugars is greater. They call it diastatic power. And so they use this to a large degree to make sure they get complete sugar and not a whole lot of leftover carbohydrates, sweetness, or breadiness, or starchiness left in the beer. So what the goal there is to make a beer, the end potential to be very, very dry. And so that's how these session IPAs work real well. Some trends we've seen in the last year or two has been the Brut IPA, which is a very dry IPA. And in that instance, they are actually using additional enzymes like the things you find in Beano, the over-the-counter medicine, to break down starches even more completely, break more complex sugars down to very simple sugars. So the yeast has more accessibility to those sugars. They may even choose a yeast that has a better opportunity to eat more sugars. Some yeasts just leave more carbohydrates behind, like your English yeast. However, if you're an American Chico yeast or even a Champagne yeast, will do a very good job of eating those sugars to a much higher degree, creating more dryness and less residual sweetness in the beer. So that's what we get out of sort of the recipe tweaks. Now, how these beers, now the IPA is the beer style that's most likely to adapt to the low-cal trend. When they do that, you cannot leave the hops really, really high. We've had the tendency to see IPAs come down from that 70 IBU mark down to 50s, 40s, 30s, even in the 20s. And so if you make a beer very, very dry, then there's not the hop support, or I'm sorry, there's not the malt support or the malt balance required to take an edge off of that aggressive hop bite. So the hops have a tendency to come down a little bit. Brewers pull back on the amount of hops that they're using in the beers to make the beer achieve the balance that they want. That was one of the flaws in the session IPA 7-8 years ago, and the reason why it trailed off too quickly. Because there's too much carbonation, there's too much of a hop bite, and the beer left in a seltzer-like effect on the back of the throat that some people just found a little bit unappealing, and I can get why that is. So some of the really kind of cool things about calorie counting in beers is, okay, when you taste these beers, like, well, I'm going to buy a 6-pack. It's going to run me $9 or $10 for most of these 6-packs. Am I relegated to drinking an IPA when we're considering calories? Not really. Even though these beers probably do the best job of reducing the calorie and reducing the waistline and reducing the worry that you have on your mind, the guilt of drinking a high-calorie beer. There's some other things you can do too. Choose a beer that does not have a lot of sweetness in it, and you can do this just by tasting it. Trust your taste buds. If it seems dry, then it's probably a beer that has less weight on the body. If it's a beer that's sweet, like a barley wine or imperial stout, that's the opposite. That's a beer that has a lot of residual sweetnesses in the beer, so therefore a lot of calories. Alcohol itself has a lot of calories as well, but I have a tendency to worry a little bit less about the alcohol calories. One of the big secrets that some of these articles we read doesn't tell you is that alcohol, especially the clean ethanol flavors that you get with most fermented products, not distilled products, but fermented products, is very clean alcohol, and it really vapes off a lot as you breathe. Your lungs expel a lot of alcohol vapor, especially when we sleep. So if the beer is a really clean beer, really dry beer with these very clean ethanols in them, then you have a tendency to vape off all of those calories and they don't add to the waistline. So when you're looking at beers that are detrimental to your waistline or detrimental to your calorie count of the day, alcohol plays a factor, but not as big a factor as you want. The bigger factor is the residual sugars. So all those big heavy porters, if it tastes bready, if it tastes sweet, if it tastes like you would replace it with dessert, it's probably not the beer that's going to really help your waistline. So you really need to think about beers that are a little drier. Some other variations are saisons, standard strength IPAs, if you don't mind drinking something that's a little bit higher in alcohol. Some of your Belgian beers, because Belgian yeast has a tendency to metabolize sugar to a great degree. So most of your Belgian beers can have a lot of dryness associated with them and not feel so hard on the stomach. Beers that are opposite, or like I said, your British beers with a lot of residual sweetness, Scottish ales, those have a tendency to have a lot of sugar left over in them. Okay, so today's beer school, there's not a whole lot of history to talk about beyond what we just did. There's not a whole lot to get into. This is my first low-cal IPA beer school that I've done, so I had to put this together, and it's been a little bit more of a challenge than the ones I do more repetitiously, so I thank you guys for sticking with me. The alcohol ranges on these usually going to carry between 3.5% to about 4, maybe 5% in some odd instances. Bitterness in these is going to be pretty moderate, not very high. You put these in a tumbler. I would almost treat them like you would a Pilsner whenever it comes to the temperature in the glassware, because they're so dry, they're so light, they're so refreshing. 38, 40 degrees, I'm not afraid to get them that cool. And also put them in a tumbler, something like this, something with volume in it, so it can contain 12, 16 ounces of your favorite, and you can drink them for refreshments. Don't look for a whole lot of nuance, or a whole lot of character, a whole lot of complexity of these. They're a one-dimensional dialogue between very low malt content and quite high hop content. So you got that going for you. Before we get too deeper into it, we'll go ahead and run through some examples here. The Dogfish Head, Slightly Mighty, has probably been the most popular example of this style for some time now. I think 3 years this one's been out. They use monk fruit in this beer. And when you say monk fruit, I don't know what monk fruit tastes like. We don't have to, because monk fruit is basically a fruit of sweetness. It doesn't have any discernible flavors outside, it's just sweet. But the sweetness doesn't contain any calories. The sweetness is calorie-free, so that's the reason why they use this in this beer. That's one of the reasons why it's been the most popular one for a couple of years now. One of the newcomers to the market has been the popularity of Bell's Two-Hearted Ale, which some schools of thought think is the best IPA in America. Well, Bell said, we're going to take that popularity and we're going to reduce it. We're going to take out some calories, we're going to take out some of the bite, we're going to take out some of the aggression, we're also going to take out some flavor. There's always a trade-off. You give up flavor, complexity, and charm with refreshment, crispness, cleanness. So there's always a trade-off there, and the Lighthearted Ale adapts to those trade-offs particularly well. Celebrating the LGBTQ win in New York City, Brooklyn come out with the Stonewall Inn IPA. It's basically a session ale that has some British nuances, but has some American hops. It has the dryness to reduce those calories down, give you a really nice flavor, well-balanced beer, more like a pale ale than an IPA in this beer. And so this has been one of my fan favorites since it came out maybe a month ago. I've taken several of these home, enjoyed them myself. Deschutes Wowza. It's a really nice one, a little bit more of an herbal take, less fruity on this from the hops, a little bit more on the herbal side, some lemon verbena notes, some lemongrass, some sassafras, green tea characteristics coming through on this one. So I like this one a lot. It has a little bit more of a bite, almost a grassier botanical bite in the back of the throat, which I enjoy. One of my favorite beers is Stone IPA, so if I want some of the similar characteristics I find in the more earthy Stone IPA, I can find them here, just at a lower calorie count. But like I said, the IPA is not the only style that has to be low-cal. Rheingeist, their logo, is a low-cal tart peach ale. So that's this guy right here, and it's very refreshing, very crisp, clean too. It almost drinks like an alcoholic seltzer, but it is a beer. So you can adapt that low-cal mantra and apply it to other styles if breweries want to. But right now we see most of that interest come in the form of a sort of a low-cal pale ale or IPA, and in Rheingeist's case, maybe a tart refresher. So you got that as well. What do you pair with these beers? I would kind of go away from the aggressive foods that you find that pair well with IPA and go with something like a little bit more of an aged brie characteristic. Some bries take on that subtle blue veining, kind of like a Gorgonzola will, but without that intensity of the Gorgonzola. So something a little bit more soft on the palate. Keep in mind that you want to choose cheeses, entrees, desserts that don't overwhelm the beer. You want the intensities to kind of match. And so I think a brie will match these flavors really well. These beers have a little bit more carbonated value You don't notice it in their higher calorie versions, but in these lower calorie versions, the carbonation bounces out a little bit quicker. There's not enough malt to hold that carbonation in and keep it creamy, so the carbonation wants to come out very rapidly, and you feel that carbonic bite on the tongue. And so you want beer, and that lightens the characteristics somewhat. So you need to choose foods that match that lightness. Chicken kebabs, Mediterranean style, Greek street food, gyros. I think those kind of foods really match real well with these beers, because there's an herbal nature about these beers, and there's an herbal bite to it. There's a little bit of bitterness. There's some characteristics I think just resonates real well with Mediterranean herbs, particularly Greek. Don't be afraid to go Italian, Tuscan. I think those all work well too. But there's just something about Greek cuisine, maybe the dill, maybe the mint, maybe the oregano heavy dishes, that speak to me whenever it comes to these sessionelles. And whenever it comes to dessert, think outside the box a little bit. You don't always need death by chocolate cake to be a dessert. Sometimes a dessert can be peanut brittle or some sort of butterscotch flavor. So I think those flavors can match up real well here, because these beers are largely void of sweetness. So those subtle sweetnesses you get like in a peanut brittle or a butterscotch will match those particularly well. And I think because you get that nutty earthiness with the herbal earthiness of the hops, you gotta get a story that becomes a little bit more rounded, a little bit more complete when you put them together. So I hope you've enjoyed this low-cal IPA or low-cal L beer school. Like I said, I think I kind of botched it a little bit, but I think we got through it okay. I'm going to leave with 2 notes. Number 1, next week I think we're going to veer a little bit. I want to do a different kind of beer school too. I haven't done it in a very long time. We're going to do beer and food pairings. I want to get very in deep and probably talk 15 or 20 minutes about how to set up a proper beer and food pairing techniques. I'm going to kind of dump my mind into the phone here and let you guys take a look into how I go through choosing which kind of beers go with what kind of foods and why. So it's kind of going to be the Cliff Notes or cheat sheet version. The last thing I want to leave you guys with is there's been a lot of strife in the world and the United States here lately. Not going to get political. I'm not going to be motivated by those things, but I will say care for each other, love each other, listen to each other. It's more important now than we've ever done that before. There's a lot of problems in the world. If we do those things, care for the person beside you, care for the person across the street, care for the person that lives near you, that works near you, that shops near you, that entertains near you. Have compassion. Have care, exercise those things, and exercise those things loudly. I beg you guys to do that. It's more important than ever. And from the bottom of my heart, I love you guys. That's the reason why I put this together every week. I don't do it for me. I do it because I think you'll find value in it. And if you can exercise anything you've learned in the last 15 or 20 minutes of this conversation, just love each other. Thank you.